When I first came here to tell the story of the Parramatta Female Factory, I thought I understood the history held within these walls. This was a place of confinement for female convicts, a place where women were put to work, separated from their families and controlled by a system that claimed discipline would lead to reform. But the story of this precinct did not end when the convict era faded away. For almost 90 years, buildings within these grounds became part of another institution, one created not for adult prisoners, but for girls. It became known by several names: the Parramatta Girls Industrial School, the Parramatta Girls Training Home, the Parramatta Girls Training School, and more simply, the Parramatta Girls Home. Each title suggested education, training, care, and a promise of a better future. But for many girls who passed through these gates, the experience was remembered very differently. The institution opened here in 1887, inside buildings that once formed part of the old Roman Catholic orphan school. It combined two very different roles. It was an industrial school for girls placed under government welfare control, and a reformatory for those accused or convicted of offences. But within the crowded buildings, those distinctions often disappeared. Girls charged with crimes could be housed beside children who had committed no offences at all. Some were orphaned, some were homeless, some had been neglected or abandoned, others had been removed from violent or unstable homes. Girls could also be sent here after foster placements failed, or because authorities described them as uncontrollable. Some had been caught wandering the streets selling goods or committing minor offences. Others were placed here simply because the government believed they required protection or control. Under the laws of the time, children could be committed to an institution for years. A sentence to an industrial school often lasted around 4 years. For many girls, that meant losing a large part of their childhood behind institutional walls. Until 1928, children as young as 2 years old could be sent to Parramatta. By the early 1950s, the youngest girls were generally around 10. At any one time, between 160 to 200 girls could be held here. By the late 1960s, numbers across Parramatta and its annexes had risen to more than 300. Across the institution's long history, it has been estimated that up to 30,000 girls pass through the Parramatta system, 30,000 individual lives, 30,000 different stories, and many of those stories remain unheard for decades. The official purpose of the institution was training and reform. Girls were taught laundry work, sewing, cooking, cleaning, and other domestic duties. The skills expected of servants and houseworkers. Formal education remained a low priority. The institution was supposed to prepare girls for a respectable life outside, but inside, the buildings were repeatedly described as overcrowded, bleak and unsuitable. Girls placed here for welfare reasons lived alongside those committed through the courts. Children who had experienced neglect, abuse, or poverty were subjected to the same strict discipline as those considered as offenders. The government described this as protection, but to many of the girls, it felt like punishment. Even in its earliest years, there were signs that something was deeply wrong. Girls began rioting as early as 1889. There were escapes, disturbances, complaints, and repeated allegations concerning punishment and mistreatment. These events were often presented publicly as evidence of troublesome or rebellious inmates, but the girls themselves offered another explanation. During an inquiry in 1898, one girl explained why they had caused the disturbance. "We thought by playing up we could go to court and be able to tell all we had to say." That single sentence changes the meaning of the riots. For some girls, breaking windows, defying staff, or attempting to escape was not simply a rebellion. It was a way of forcing the outside world to listen, a way of reaching a courtroom, an inquiry, or anyone beyond these walls who might allow them to speak. The 1898 inquiry held directly from the girls. One described being punished for talking and again for quietly humming while working in the laundry. She recalled receiving 12 strikes across the hands. The inquiry also heard evidence of solitary confinement, unrecorded canings, slaps, and a punishment known as standing out, where a girl could be forced to remain standing for hours with her arms held behind her back. The inquiry revealed a closed institution filled with conflict. Staff members accused one another, girls were drawn into personal disputes, discipline could be inconsistent and arbitrary. The matron was eventually replaced, but the institution remained, the walls remained, the routines remained, and the decades that followed, the complaints continued. This was a pattern that would define Parramatta Girls Home: a disturbance, an inquiry, a report, a promise of reform, then another generation of girls would pass through the same gates. The institution would change its name several times, but behind these new names, many of the old problems remained. As the 20th century continued, the voices from within these walls would become harder to ignore. As the years passed, the institution changed its name. The Parramatta Girls Industrial School became the Parramatta Girls Training Home. Later, the Parramatta Girls Training School. Each new title suggested progress, a fresh beginning, a new philosophy, but for many girls inside, very little appeared to change. Life here followed strict routine. Bells marked the beginning and end of each day. Girls cleaned, cooked, worked in the laundry, sewed clothing, and performed the domestic duties expected of them. Education often came second. The official aim was to prepare young women for employment as domestic servants. But behind the daily routine, the institution was struggling. The buildings were overcrowded, resources were stretched. Girls placed here for welfare reasons continued to live alongside girls who had been charged with offences. Children who needed care found themselves inside an institution built around discipline. The problems became impossible to ignore. Again and again, girls protested, some escaped, others damaged property. There were riots, complaints, and repeated government inquiries. To outsiders, these events were often described as acts of rebellion, but many former residents remember something very different. One young girl later explained why they caused the disturbance. "We thought by playing up we could go to court and be able to tell all we had to say." Those words reveal something deeper for some girls. The only way to be heard was to force somebody to investigate. In 1941, another major disturbance erupted. Furniture was overturned, windows were smashed, police were called in to restore order. The riot prompted yet another investigation. This time, the New South Wales Child Welfare Advisory Council undertook one of the most detailed examinations of the institution ever conducted. Its findings were devastating. The council criticised the overcrowded buildings, the lack of trained staff, poor education, limited recreation, inadequate rehabilitation, and an institution that was unable to meet the vastly different needs of the girls placed inside it. The report warned that the institution could never properly care for children whose backgrounds, ages, and circumstances differed so greatly. It called for new facilities, better education, specialised staff, greater aftercare, and a complete rethink of how vulnerable young people were treated. The recommendations were welcomed. Reforms were announced. The institution was renamed once again. Official reports spoke of change, but many former residents would later say the reality inside remained much the same. The building stayed, many of the staff remained, the routines continued, and so did the complaints. Throughout the following decades, government annual reports showed smiling girls learning to cook, playing basketball, making dresses, and taking part in organised activities. Official photographs presented an image of order, training, and opportunity, but behind those carefully chosen images, another story was unfolding. Former residents described an institution marked by fear, strict discipline, and control. Two very different versions of Parramatta existed at the same time, one presented to the public, the other remembered by those who lived behind these walls. By the 1960s, The institution had become even more crowded. Girls nearing release could be transferred to the privileged home at Ormond. Others, those accused of breaking the rules inside Parramatta, faced a very different destination. Following a series of disturbances in 1961, authorities opened an annex at Hay, a former prison in western New South Wales. Girls were transported there, often overnight, and kept in harsh isolation before eventually being returned to Parramatta. For many, Hay became another chapter in the same system. Nearly every generation that passed through Parramatta experienced the same pattern: another disturbance, another inquiry, another report, another promise that things would improve. Yet decade after decade, the voices of the girls continued to tell a very different story. And it would take many more years before Australia finally began listening. By the early 1970s, the institution was becoming increasingly difficult to defend. Former residents, women rights campaigners, journalists, and members of the public were beginning to ask difficult questions. In 1973, protests were held outside the Parramatta Girls Training School, led by women's rights advocate Bessie Guthrie. The demonstrations attracted public attention and parliamentary debate. Television programs also began exposing conditions inside institutions like Parramatta. For one of the first times, the voices of the former residents were beginning to reach the wider audience. Late in 1974, the Parramatta Girls Training School officially closed. Some girls were transferred to other institutions. The buildings themselves found new purposes. For nearly 90 years, the gates that had opened for generation after generation of young, vulnerable young women, now the chapter had finally ended, but for those who had lived here, the memories remained. For many years, former residents carried their experiences quietly. Some believed nobody would ever believe what had happened. Others simply wanted to leave the past behind. But history has a way of refusing to stay silent. As more women began sharing their experiences, the clearer picture of life inside Parramatta slowly emerged. Not through rumour, not through legend, but through hundreds of individual memories. Many describing remarkably similar experiences despite being separated by decades. In 2014, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Abuse examined Parramatta Girls as one of its case studies. Former residents gave evidence of physical and psychological abuse. They described harsh punishments, isolation, humiliation and fear. The Commission found that many allegations had never been properly investigated when the institution was operating. For decades, the voices of these women had been dismissed. Now, they were finally being heard. Out of those experiences, something remarkable emerged. Former residents came together to form an organisation known as Parragirls, not simply to remember what happened, but to ensure it could never be forgotten. Through reunions, books, documentaries, public exhibitions and educational programs, they transformed a place once associated with silence into one of remembrance. One symbol of that resilience survives today. The letters ILWA, I love, worship and adore, words scratched into walls, written in notes, and quietly shared between the girls as acts of friendship, support and survival. A reminder that even inside an institution built around control, human connection endured. Today these buildings are recognised as part of one of Australia's most significant historical precincts, not only because of their convict history, but because of everything that followed. The campaign to preserve this site continues, not to celebrate the institution, but to remember those who lived through it. Because history is not only found in grand victories or famous people, sometimes history lives in places where ordinary people were expected to remain silent. When I first walked through these grounds, I thought I was returning to tell another chapter of the female factory. Instead, I found something much larger, a story carried by thousands of girls, some forgotten, some finally heard. The walls that stand here today have witnessed almost 2 centuries of Australian history, but perhaps the greatest purpose now is not to imprison the past, but to ensure it is never hidden again. Because preserving places like this is about far more than protecting old buildings. It's about protecting memory and making sure the voices that once echoed behind these walls continue to be heard, even after the gates have long since closed.